Ragnar, welcome to Monero Magazine, man. It's good to have you on.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks.
I've heard you talk about in other podcasts how towards the end of a civilization, towards the end of an empire, we generally see increasing irrationality in the laws and customs of the so-called empire. So we're seeing one of the weapons that underpins the US empire being the dollar. We're seeing that collapsing at the moment. We're also seeing increasingly irrational, laws and cultures being sort of introduced in society, whether that's, having to report every transaction over $600 to the IRS. The G20 agreed last week to implement vaccine passports. We're seeing this whole narrative and mandates of ESG and DEI. Nearly all central banks are planning to introduce CBDCs. So where do you see Monero playing a role in fighting against these, as we frame up, increasingly rational dystopian laws and cultures?
I see Monero as a powerful tool and as a lifeline. I think everything is going to get worse. I think CBDs are coming, central bank digital currencies are coming. I think everything is absolutely going to get worse in every single way. And Monero is the best cryptocurrency out there straight out of the box. Now we need Bitcoin, but Monero I think you have to get competent with Monero if you have any chance of making it in the next, foreseeable future.
Why is that? How do you specifically see Monero protecting the users from these dystopian laws and cultures?
Well, it's because the privacy is so much better out of the box, whereas Bitcoin, as we know, is a lot easier to track, and you really have to do a lot of work to really have good privacy with Bitcoin. Whereas Monero, I think the average crypto user can use Monero responsibly, good enough to have their privacy. And because of that, it's why it's so important. Um, as we've seen, there's all sorts of, it's hard to keep track of all the new laws that they're proposing, but I know there's one in the US that's looking really awful. And so I would say the technology first, but the second part I would say is people. So there's a lot of great people working on Monero, using Monero, building Monero. And so if you want to be with some of the smartest, toughest people in the world who also have the same goals of absolute privacy and survivability, Monero is it. I mean, it is a place you want to be in terms of people.
So I would just finish sort of asking to finish the argument, if you will. So why Bitcoin at all if Monero protects you from XYZ? What do you think Bitcoin provides in that case?
The number one thing Bitcoin provides is liquidity. So just a lot more people have Bitcoin, accept Bitcoin, know how to use Bitcoin. So that's kind of the main thing. Like, so if you look at like cyber criminals, like the big ones, right? Like North Korea, who do these really large, um, hacks and ransomware, they accept Bitcoin and they're okay with it, and because it can be traced, but they're relying on more as like their power as a state than as being able to remain more anonymous on the blockchain. So you still will have large actors using Bitcoin simply because it's the biggest out there in liquidity. So that's what Bitcoin brings. The other thing that Bitcoin brings is that it's on most exchanges and it's not blacklisted from exchanges, and there's not a lot of pushback. And so it's kind of this threading the needle where regulators are okay with it. They don't want to ban it outright. It is traceable enough for them to be comfortable with it, and there is the liquidity there. So ultimately, I think Bitcoin and Monero are the key ones you want to have.
So what stage do you think we're at? As I mentioned at the start, at least in my opinion, we are seeing increasingly irrational laws and customs and movements, if you will. What stage of the empire collapse, if you want to frame it up as that, what stage do you think we're at?
I think we're at the beginning of the slow collapse, of the complete reordering of the world, and I don't know where it ends up, but we're just really starting to see the fracture lines, both in terms of finances. I mean, the U.S. can only have such big of deficits for so long, and the ethnic conflicts can only go on for so long, and China can only be held back for so long, and you just go through the list of those things. And so we're just, I think, at the beginning of the breaking point, and it's just a matter of, I think, how slowly things unwind. That's the real question. Like with the US dollar, is it going to be just kind of the slow decline in the BRICS is what takes over, or China? Is it going to be gold crypto, or is it going to be kind of like big, uh, big issues rather than a long drawn out process? And I think our best hope is that it's a slower decline rather than a rapid decline. That's the question: is how fast or slow?
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be a situation more of like a death by a thousand cuts. Is that kind of how you see it, if you had to guess one way or another?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's sort of like there'll be kind of jumps. A lot will
Yeah, sure.
happen in a couple days, and then nothing will happen for a couple years, and so you'll see those big jumps of the events. But overall, I think you just have to plan out. Like if you're our age, like not our parents' age, like we've got several decades, if not multiple decades, that we're going to be alive. And so if you think in terms of decades rather than years, then you say, okay, well, I don't know exactly how long it's going to take. I don't know what's going to fall first. I don't know the order of things, but I just kind of know the broad strokes of the next decade. And so what am I going to do? I'm going to use Bitcoin, Monero. I'm going to have better privacy. I'm going to think about what I can do for a living that will still be around for several years, no matter what happens in geopolitics. I'm going to still need my good friends, my associates that I trust. I'm going to have these certain values. I'm not going to make unnecessary enemies, all those things, to just to think of what happens in a world that's worse than the one we grew up in.
I mean, it's a pretty standard question, but why does privacy matter? Why to everybody else besides people within the crypto space?
I don't think you could really have a civilization without privacy. I think it was Ayn Rand who said something like the distinction between kind of a primitive society and an advanced society is privacy. And I think she said something along the lines of, when you're in a barbaric state, a really rudimentary state, you don't have any privacy. You're living in a tribe, in mud huts, and everyone is sharing, the same long hut, and everyone knows everything. There's no barrier between the walls because you're living in mud huts or in the forest or whatever it might be. But civilization means you have walls, you have houses, you have rule of law, you have some human rights. And so without privacy, I just think everything goes out the window. You can't have intimate relationships with, your spouse, with your family, with your kids. You can't have private thoughts. You can't do business. I mean, we saw why privacy was important in the communist regimes, right? In China, in the Soviet Union, we saw what happens without privacy, and it is true dystopia. All the bad things that the communists did, they were able to do because people couldn't keep certain things private.
I have a lot of questions sort of stemming from that, but what do you think is a reasonably private or respectfully private society? What do you think that looks like? What are the norms?
I think you can tell when there's a respectably private society when people feel comfortable day to day with their thoughts and who they talk to. I think when people are afraid to say things to just normal people, I think that's a bad indication. You should always feel uncomfortable saying bad things and controversial things, even if you agree with your own thoughts. But to just have sort of normal conversations where you have to think a second, and certain transactions where you don't want to set off alarm bells for kind of normal stuff, I think that's a sign something's gone wrong. Um, and I think we're starting to move into that territory.
So moving back to the crypto side, I sort of think of you in a lot of ways as like an OG Bitcoin maximalist, sort of someone who was there for the cypherpunk mentality, kind of before the whole, what I say is like a toxic Bitcoin cult came up.
Hmm.
What's your message to the specific laser eyes maxis about Monero?
Well, I think if they oppose Monero, they oppose Satoshi's vision. So Satoshi, by all indications, was a cypherpunk. If you look at where he released his code in his white paper, I mean, clearly he was a cypherpunk. And for Satoshi, it's clear he saw it as a tool. And so if you are for Bitcoin, you are for the purpose of Bitcoin. And Monero fills that purpose of Bitcoin in a unique and I would say better way. And to me, Monero is a litmus test. It's an intelligence test, definitely, to see if you understand what good technology looks like. But I also would say it's sort of a character test. And it shows that, are you willing to use something that is superior in many ways based on utility rather than your own pride and greed? Because I think what's behind a lot of the laser-eyed maximalism is just greed. I just think that's all it is. I think it's just insecurity that some other coin will slightly decrease their bags that they hold, and that's it. They don't have technical arguments. They don't have moral arguments. Their arguments is just the bags. And I think the good news is that because we've been in such a bear market, like this is the worst bear market. And I started 2011. I've been through lots of bear markets and bull markets. This is the worst one. And I think the good thing about that is it's burning out a lot of the people who are in it just for ridiculous gains. And so I actually think Bitcoin culture has gotten a lot better, especially since ordinals came on board. I think it's a lot better. And you see this in the conferences and the events and the online conversations. So I'm actually optimistic on Bitcoin.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Where do you think this whole, I know you said it stems from like insecurity, but where did it actually come from? Because when I sort of got into Bitcoin in 2015, 2016, I don't actually recall there being any Bitcoin maximalists. I can't say I was deep in the Bitcoin space at the time, but I don't recall there being any Bitcoin maximalists around. But sort of it's popped up, and I think through the block size wars, and then kind of just built from there, if you will. But where do you think it came from?
Yeah, I agree. The block size wars definitely kind of ignited the fuse. There was always this element of Bitcoin being kind of the superior one. Like there's an early Bitcoin OG, BTC, um, Drake. I'm missing it, but basically he has his avatar in the Bitcoin talk forums was Gollum, right, holding on to his coin. And so there was always that idea of the coin and holding on to it, and the superiority of it. It was just people weren't so militant about it. It was sort of a joke, but it kind of wasn't. But yeah, the block size wars really, you know, made it go forward. And I think the problem was that because of the block size wars, people got this way overinflated sense of, I think, confidence. I think of like victory and arrogance, and it really kind of brought out the worst in people, where they thought that they were so superior because they overcame this weird argument, really, in terms of like a parameter of the you know size of blocks. And so it really kind of injected a lot of arrogance into a lot of people and a superiority complex. And then that also kind of coincided with a great, bull market. And so between the price going up, between the block size wars, it just kind of brought out kind of a lot of greed and arrogance. And a lot of people, I would say that, and I would say a few charismatic people who then made more people want to imitate that same behavior and attitude to get the same amount of attention. And then we get ourselves into this cycle of people repeating behaviors that get more attention and more. It's just extremism. That's what it is, right? I mean, that the least tolerant person wins. And unfortunately, we got into a weird cycle of it. But I'm optimistic. I think a lot of that's going away.
Was I suppose, your lack of a monotheistic attitude towards Bitcoin and cryptos in general, was that already part of you, or was there sort of a stage where you were a Bitcoin maximalist and then you had sort of a realization or a process towards a realization?
Yeah, I've kind of fell into a weird spot. I know people used to maybe call me a maximalist. I never felt comfortable with that. I mean, I was always very adamantly against Ethereum for a long time. Like I remember at the Miami North American Bitcoin Conference when they announced Ethereum, I was in the second row and Vitalik stood up and talked about Ethereum, and it was so inferior in terms of its design, and there were so many scams with ICOs, and I was involved in some real estate stuff, trying to get real estate involved with Bitcoin. And I turned down multiple ICOs who wanted me to be, like a CTO, or wanted me to be an advisor or shill the ICO. And I turned down a lot of money, and I actually hated all the scams, and I hated all the ICOs and all the Ethereum stuff and all the scam coins. So in some ways, people maybe thought I was a maximalist, but I was just anti pretty much everything that was bad, and most things were bad. So kind of by default, Bitcoin is kind of one of the only good things, but I knew it wasn't the only good thing. I knew Monero was good. I knew there were a couple other things were pretty good. And so it was kind of this weird thing where it's like, well, everything kind of does suck compared to Bitcoin, but not everything does. Not everything is a scam. And so it took it. That's why I say Monero is kind of an IQ test, because you can understand that, okay, most crypto things are stupid and a scam, but again, not everything. Not
I've
everything is a scam.
I've seen and heard you talking about stacks a bit as well. What's going on over there?
Yeah, so Stacks is great. It's the layer two blockchain, so it allows you to do more smart contract stuff, and the settlements, the transactions settle onto Bitcoin, and they've got a big release coming up. It's sort of a Stacks 2.0 or even a 3.0 that's going to allow more kind of smart contracting abilities and being able to write to Bitcoin, which opens up a lot of cool things you can do on Bitcoin and sort of make Bitcoin more flexible in terms of DeFi, if you can say that word with Bitcoin, but actually really cool DeFi stuff. So that's something Monero doesn't quite have, right? Is we don't have that smart contracting ability like Bitcoin has. So that's another kind of cool thing that Bitcoin can do is more those types of applications.
So I've seen you were building something called Trajan. I believe it's maybe pronounced incorrectly.
Trajan,
Trajan,
yeah.
yeah. I knew I'd get it wrong no matter what. But you're also the founder of what people know as Guns and Bitcoin. I know that you're having a new conference next year called Finney Forum. Tell us what's going on with that.
Yeah, Finney Forum is great. It's going to be focused on Bitcoin, Monero, cybersecurity, and privacy in general. And obviously, the name comes from Hal Finney, who was the original cypherpunk, and he was the one who came up with the idea of cryptographic trading cards, which today we know as sort of ordinals or even NFTs to a certain extent. Obviously, Hal Finney was the first person to receive a Bitcoin transaction. So, yeah, Forum Finney's coming up in March of 2024 in Dallas, Texas, finneyforum.com. And we're going to have a variety of speakers kind of covering all those topics, the best things about Bitcoin, Monero, cybersecurity, and privacy. And that's sort of my real focus in terms of events. We're not doing a Guns and Bitcoin conference this year, next year. Focus is on Finney Forum.
And why is that again?
Well, because it's what's needed right now. I think, sort of the gun stuff it is where it is, and there's not much that can be said or done about it, but there's a lot more that we can do in terms of Monero and in terms of bringing people up to speed with Bitcoin in terms of what they can do with privacy, CoinJoin, and kind of some new applications. I mean, even ordinals is actually kind of a cypherpunk application because you can store once, pay once and store forever. You can create web pages, you can create documents that can never ever be censored. Like you could have interactive websites built on ordinals that can never be taken down. So that's something we will cover at the Finney Forum, is something like that. So that's pretty exciting if you're a privacy advocate, if you're someone who wants censorship resistance, is ordinals of all things.
That's cool, man. I obviously don't want to drop anything here, but obviously we've been speaking about whatever we've been speaking about in regards to the conference. But where can people find you online on social media?
Yeah. So Twitter's the best place. So Ragnar Lift, so RAGNARLIF is the best place. And I have links to everything there. And then I have a website, kind of my personal website. It's ragnarly.com. Ragnarly.com is also kind of where I, have some blog posts and things like that.
Thanks very much for coming on the podcast, Ragnar. It's been great. Yeah, thanks so much, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.